So, what I want to discuss today is a little of my point of view and some of the issues or problems I see with the US political or election system in particular. And a few of those things we're going to talk about, the two party system, biases, ways you're raised and brought up in certain political households. I see a big difference in age groups and demographics of voting. So I'm going to cover certain things like that. We'll start off with a little of my own background. I would consider myself a Democrat for a majority of my life until the second Obama administration. I had voted Democrat and I considered myself a Democrat. I'm kind of always been, I'm not a big fan of the two party system. We're going to talk about that. I'm not going to get too much into it right this moment while I'm talking about this, but we'll get to that momentarily. But yeah, I kind of feel like I vote candidate, not party for one. And as I've become more aware of things and gotten a little older and maybe value different things or look at life a little different, we all have different phases in our life where we gain perspective. I guess I've become a little more Republican than Democrat in typical fashion, or at least the way I saw it as growing up. And to the same extent, I kind of feel like the Democratic Party left me more than I left it. They've just got so extreme in a lot of cases that I can't stand behind a lot of the candidates and a lot of the policies, beliefs, et cetera, et cetera. So, I didn't vote for an election. I believe I missed one in between. Can't quite remember. Maybe I did. Anyhow, um, yeah, I mean, right now, with what I'm seeing in the current administration and what's happened in the last 3 years or so of, Democrats being in control of the White House, I don't think we've made improvements, and I don't think it's been a very good presidency. So, call it what you will, because I'm going to talk about this a little, and maybe this is hypocritical. But there's no way I'm voting Democrat, or at least the candidate that right now we think is running, and Biden in his reelection campaign. I wouldn't say I'm a huge Trump guy. I have become more and more of a Trump guy, just because I thought he did a really lot while he was in office his 4 years. He actually did what he said. I don't like the way he goes about things, right? There's certain ways to phrase things. Shaq had a great example when he was hanging out with Donald Trump and didn't have his shirt tucked in, where a lot of people would say, "Hey, Shaq, we're going to a nice fancy place. You're wearing a suit. Like, it'd be cool if you tuck your shirt in." Trump just looks at him and says, "Tuck your effing shirt in," right? He's just very direct and blunt, and that rubs some people the wrong way. I also don't mind it because I would rather very direct and blunt than some bullshit and lies that I hear on a lot of the other sides. Time and campaigns and stories. Like, Biden is just a notorious liar in so many different instances that have been proven. Things about where he said where he finished in his graduating class, things about being a minor in Pennsylvania, things about truck driver. There's just all kinds of things he said in life that never happened or that totally aren't true, and he knows it, but he's still telling the story. So I'd rather somebody blunt and upfront and direct. I also like the fact that whether it's Trump or a guy like Vivek Ramaswamy, who's running now, I like people who aren't career politicians. I think that's part of the problem with our political system outside of the presidency, right? Where you can only serve 2 terms, which is a good thing. There's other seats where you can serve unlimited amounts. And we've had people in Congress for 40, 50, 60 years that are making themselves rich and the middle class and the American public more and more poor. I think that's one of the big issues. So I would rather see more non-career politicians or first time, electees or candidates running for office and give people a chance that actually are going to serve the public with a very, specific purpose and desire. I think career politicians are in it for more agendas. Unfortunately, like it, generally, of course, you can talk about anybody specifically. I mean, generally, there's a lot of corruption and a lot of greed and a lot of personal wealth that gets amassed while these people are in Congress, in Senate, et cetera, et cetera. And that was another big thing about Trump. He was the first president in many, many years that I looked back on that his net worth decreased when he became president. He actually, because he was a successful businessman and had a lot of revenue coming in, and of course, he donated his whole salary as a president, which isn't going to make you wealthy, super rich anyhow. I'm sure it's great for the average person, but for a guy like Trump, it was a huge pay cut. And he donated it all. So not that that really mattered, but he couldn't run and operate and be part of certain businesses while he was president, and he took a big hit in his overall net worth. That also lets me know that somebody, whether you like them or not, right, if they are hurting themselves in the pocket, I'm more inclined to believe they're doing things for the right reasons than somebody else who is amassing more wealth and kind of sugarcoating or kind of glossing over and not taking a definitive stance and being flip flop and things like that. When you go to the topic of race, I mean, Biden is kind of a racist throughout his life in many ways. In some of his phrases, I mean, when I say I vote candidate, I look at guys, and I'm going to talk about biases, and this ties into it a little bit. But a guy like Biden, again, been in office that long, I can look back at what he's done in his 40 years, right? And I can amass a judgment of, should this guy stay in office? Should he be president, right? Or whatever. And then now with, 3 going on 4 years of his presidency, I can take this presidency and policies and what's happened and the overall economy, everything that's happened, and say, no, I don't want 4 more years of this, right? But going back to Biden, I mean, his 93 crime bill, all you Biden supporters, if you're watching, right? If you guys aren't familiar with the 93 crime bill that he authored, that was particularly, and it was actually is the number one crime bill ever, passed through Congress and the Senate that incarcerated more of the minority or the African American population, right? So as much as he says he's for the minorities, and his quote, if you're not black, if you vote for Trump, you might as well not be black, or however he said it, right? I mean, that's a racist statement in itself right there. But how can he say that when he authored a crime bill that kept that community in jail longer? I mean, he had a phrase or a quote he said on the Senate floor that we should put them all back in chains. We all know what and who he was referring to in the context of that conversation. So when you start to talk about, the way that everything is spun in politics, it's just, and then when you look at it from the outside view that I mentioned of people's career body of work, people's agenda, who's profiting, who's not, like, follow the dollar. That tells you a lot of things in every aspect, in politics, in business, in investments. You follow the dollar trail. In corruption, right? It usually comes back to who's cashing the check at the end. And I think we're seeing some of that come out with the First Family right now. So those are a lot of the things. We'll kind of dive into next the two-party system and kind of thoughts on that. My thoughts on the two-party system is I don't think it's a great thing, to be honest. I think there should either be a no-party system, or I know we've had independents, and back in the day there were others. We started with the Whig Party being very prevalent in the United States, which was later kind of replaced and, well, it was kind of transformed into both of these in a sense, although this already kind of existed. Some Whigs went into some of each of these parties, so it's hard to say specifically if you look back through history. But I'm not here to talk about, late 17, early 1800 politics so much as more current and modern day, right? But this is one of the images I just found online when I did a generic search, right? And this is what it says for three or four quick things: is Republicans, wealthier backgrounds, more rural, believe in individualism, lower tax rates. I don't know about the wealthier backgrounds. That's debatable. That's a capitalist society. There's a lot of Democrats with wealthy backgrounds too. That one's hard to say. I would agree with the rest, and I kind of correlate with all the rest. I don't correlate to the wealthier background. I grew up in a middle class, under 6-figure annual income home throughout my childhood. Kind of rural, I guess. I wasn't in a big city. I wasn't in a small city. I was somewhere in between. Believe in individualism, definitely. That kind of comes back to accountability. Like, you can change. I don't want the government or policies to change my life. I want to be able to have control over that. So people that think government handouts or new government policies, or they should give away free this and free that, there's no such thing. We all know that. It all comes back to you somewhere. So you need to make the changes and get the skill set, or get that promotion, or get a job, or whatever it is, and hold yourself accountable. People might not like hearing that, but those are the people that are sitting back and hoping for the best. And how's that working out for you, right? Lower tax rates. I would like to think everybody believes in that, but as we see, if taxes are higher, more for the wealthy. So I don't even know how that plays in, right? If taxes are higher, more for wealthy, but it's saying Republicans are wealthy. So you're saying higher taxes and give more money to the Republicans, and the people that I don't know, it doesn't even make a lot of sense. But I'm certainly for lower tax rates. I don't know who's not, but I know the Republicans are, because Republicans are more about smaller government. And that's another thing I'd like to touch on, is I think a big, big problem in this country that a lot of people aren't aware of for whatever reason. One, you're not really taught the Constitution so much. And number two, there's a lot of pride lost in it, right? Not as many people have pride for their country. Actually, kids are being grown, brought up nowadays to kind of dislike their country. You see superstars like LeBron James in that beef with the UFC fighter this week or last week that I thought was excellent that guy called him out. Can't think of his name, but check it out if you haven't seen the article. It's pretty funny. But a guy like LeBron James that this country has made $1 billion. He's a billionaire, but he never says anything nice. Doesn't stand for, like, just doesn't show respect to the country. That's like, guys, it just doesn't make sense to me, right? But the big thing I want to point out here with the government is the Constitution starts off with the government as we the people, right? The founding fathers didn't want to be beholden to a king, or they wanted a government of average men, of farmers, of construction workers, of people who were going to do the right thing. And somewhere that's changed, but the government is we the people. So in essence, anyone that works for the government, you actually have authority and power over them, not them, you. The government is beholden to you, the citizen, not vice versa. You're not beholden to the government. It's like you walk into a government establishment now and they give you orders and follow policy. They actually work for you. They pick the government job. They work in the public sector and they are public servants. They're there to serve the citizens. The citizen actually has more kind of, I don't want to say rights, but more privileges than a public official, because public official has to operate in the capacity of their job. They have certain policies, professional standards. You don't always have that as an individual citizen, right? And even when it comes to law enforcement, they answer to you until you've broken a law, or at minimum, they have reasonable articulable suspicion, and they can say that to you of what law you've broken and how that they either think that you are in the process, you have committed, or you're about to commit a crime. It's got to be reasonable articulable suspicion of one of those three things. Otherwise, any order a cop gives you is actually unlawful. The cops a lot of times say, I'm giving you a lawful order, and they believe, and they're trained this way, it's not always the individual officer's fault, that if they say an order out of their mouth, it's a lawful order because it came from law enforcement. That's not true. A lawful order has to be backed by code, or a certain, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know why it's not coming to me. Statute, right? Or whatever it's called in the law books, right? Different states have different words, but it's got to come back to an actual law that you have at least been suspected reasonably of violating, right? So anytime they tell you something, this is a lawful order. Okay, what crime do you suspect me of committing? Well, there's none. Then there's no lawful order there. You actually still have domain over a public servant until you have broken a law, or they have what I just said, right? They have no authority over you. So very similar. And just people don't get this. People just think anybody in authority, government, law enforcement, you just do what they say automatically. Well, if you're not questioning anybody that's got, say, more power or paid by your tax dollars, and you're not critically thinking about what's right and wrong, and you're just saying yes sir, no sir, I mean, you're just a sheep, and you're going to go through life that way, and it could be fine. But I think it's healthy to question anything. Your government, your parents, your boss, right? You're going to have questions, and that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing, because it brings clarity. It brings up, articulate and why am I drawing a blank as I'm saying articulate? Just brings up interesting conversation, right? And expounds upon things. So then we go over to the Democratic side. It says more average backgrounds, urban, more modest income, believe in greater support. I think that means believes in bigger government, not necessarily greater support. I think they believe in greater support from government, from policy, from free checks and welfare and unemployment and healthcare and on, right? Things like that. So the two-party system, again, if you were just going by this, I would definitely identify with more Republican as I've gotten older. And I think that kind of dives into, what I would talk about next is I've noticed that Democrats, especially the newer era of Democrats and the more liberalism, are always pushing the issues of social justice, inclusivity, and understanding, and massage their feelings, right? And I like more of the facts, the truth, right? I don't really mind, rubbing somebody's feelings the wrong way if I'm saying a factual statement. If a fact bothers you, you have your own issues. It's not what's coming out of my mouth. Why are you offended, or why are your feelings hurt because I just said a fact? Like, that's what you need to go back and think about yourself. So that never really bothers me. People always say, well, you got to be careful of people's feelings. If you can't control people's feelings, and the way some of this younger generation is raised, it's just very, very soft. But that kind of goes back to my point where I started. Like, when I was younger, in my late teens, 20s, into my 30s, I pretty much always voted Democrat, and I liked some of the more liberal, expansive policies. And at the time, they weren't near as radical as I've seen in the 2000s. In the last 20 or 25 years, it's pretty insane where it's gone to the fact of, a man can walk into a woman's dressing room and drop his pants and change next to them and beat them in sports. Like, that stuff, it just makes no freaking sense. Nobody's ever going to convince me otherwise. But, I think as I got older, I don't know if I became more conservative or less progressive. And again, I think it has part to do with what I said. I think the Democratic Party's gone a little far left and a little far radical for my liking. But also, as you get older, I think you start to value more of family, of holding on to your dollar. You start to realize everything you've paid in taxes to the government and how hard the dollar is taxed in the U.S. Employee tax, sales tax, federal tax, property tax, death tax, on and on and on. They just tax every freaking thing they can. So your dollar is taxed multiple times, which again is ridiculous, right? But as I've got older, I valued. I'm not a conservative by any means, but I definitely lean toward more conservative principles. I would rather school be more about teaching my kids math and arithmetic and science and history and computer and STEM things, and less about social causes and gender inclusivity. Like that's the schools aren't there to raise our children. We do that at home. The schools are there to educate and prepare them for the workforce, right? And to develop them. But they're not a social justice or a social moral ethic, entity over our children at all. We send them there to learn. I don't want the school raising my kid and giving it principles. That's not what they do. That's what I do at home. That's why with my daughter, when she comes home, I ask what she learned about. I say, what did they teach her? How did they kind of talk about this? And I say why what they're showing you is wrong here, or why I agree with it. And we discuss it, right? Things like that. So that's part of it as well. Looking at the political system a little further, right? This is another quick graphic I got. It says the U.S. is a democracy, which is an ideology which allows people freedom of speech, right to vote for different political parties if over 18, among many other things, right? The Constitution is set out in 3 different branches of the government: President, Congress, and Supreme Court, and separation of powers designed to stop any one branch or part of government from becoming too powerful. All great things that, going back to the founding fathers, that wanted average people who would do what's right for their fellow neighbor and that want what's best for this country. That's who our government's supposed to be. And I don't think that's who we're electing. So I want to get back to more of that. And I think that would solve a lot of problems in our country and get us going back in the direction I would like to see this country going. I am a constitutionalist at heart. If you ask me, like, how do I identify politically? As a constitutionalist. I believe that's the greatest document ever written. I believe that's what separates us from these hundreds of other countries around the world. And I also believe the best part of the Constitution is what the founding fathers knew at the time when they wrote it. They knew they didn't know everything, so they left it open to be amended and added to and altered as needed over the years. Now, we should not overtake that power and try to change things like Amendment 2, the right to bear arms, right? Yes, it can be amended to a certain degree. It better not ever be totally taken away. That's not what it was provided for, especially the initial 10, right? The Bill of Rights and the first 10. But any amendment, I want to say we're up to 27 or 28. I'd have to go check. I'm not super recent on that, so you can fact check me or whatever, or mention it in the comments. But yeah, so that's also interesting when you look back and think of things on that level. And this kind of ties right into the last image I'm going to share, and then I'm going to discuss a couple other things really quickly before I close it out here. But obviously, these are the 3 branches of government, right? We have the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch, which kind of ties back into the 3 powers that they just talked about. And what was actually created and kept private and not government, and a lot of people say is the 4th branch of government, is the media. The media was created at first, and the way that our early founding fathers and early, political figures in this country saw the media was as a private entity to hold the government accountable, right? They could do checks and balances, investigative journalism, access to free press, whether you're anybody. Like, that's another thing, right? If you're out taking pictures and a law enforcement or security might come up and say, where's your press credentials? You don't need press credentials. It's the First Amendment. The right to, freedom of press. That means anybody is the press. Anybody with a camera that can report news or stories to the local population and disseminate that information, right? However it is. Back in the day, a newspaper, photographs, right? Now we use the internet and news channels, whatever that is. And we all know how the media is now. The media, if you think every branch of government has a little level of corruption, whether you think it's a little or a lot, there's got to be some. You'd be really naive to say there's no corrupt politicians and there never has been. That would just be flat out false. We all know there have been, right? So there's some level of corruption here. And that has creeped into the media. I don't know how long that's been going on, probably a majority of my life, but it's definitely got more and more prevalent and more favoritism and sided. And you can see that clearly, which is fine to a degree, I guess. It's not fine when they're not reporting the truth or the real story to people, though, and they're deceiving people. And that's what they're doing. A majority of these elections are undereducated or falsely educated people that see one side of a story. And this ties into the last thing I really want to talk about, which is biases. Right. I think a lot of people have biases, right off the bat. I hear so many people, I hate Trump. I'll never, like, that's great. Like, you have whatever. Now, if you hate him and you have a reason, like, I had a reason why I dislike Biden. Some of the things he said, some of the things he's done in Congress, his 93 crime bill. Like, if you have policy, facts, reasons, if you're not just like, oh, he's racist. Well, what do you do that's racist? Well, he just doesn't like people just say that. Like, they don't have an actual reason. That's a bias. That's either how they were raised. A lot of people are brought up as Democrats or Republicans, and they stay the same. Now, there's other teens that rebel, right? And they want to go against their parents. And part of they'll do that is, my dad's a diehard Republican, I'm going to vote Democrat, or vice versa, right? So that can happen. But I think more often than not, you're kind of shaped by the household you're raised in and how your family is politically and how they vote. Very similar to a sports team. If you grow up in a Red Sox household, you better not be liking the Yankees, and vice versa, right? You guys know how it is. So I think that has a little to do with it. But yeah, that and then the media has the other big the big, I keep messing up my words today. Complicity in this, right? The media is very complicit in this, in terms of what I just talked about, giving you what narrative they want you to hear instead of the actual story. Whether they're talking about the police and how police shoot, like that's so rare, right? They don't show you all the good things the police do and how many good officers. I think it could certainly be better, and I would reform or revamp policing in this country, as well as the education system. That's where I would start if I was ever to get in politics and really start. It'd be revamping the kind of law enforcement and the correction system, as well as the education system. As a byproduct, that's going to actually help the economy quite a bit as well. And I want, I'm voting for people, that kind of go on those type of things. Smaller government is better. The more government and the more people we have working for government, the more control that they try to get, the more power. And that's what we're seeing right now. If the government ultimately gets power over you and can kind of tell you what to do and what not to do, that's when we become more of a socialist or communist type of country, and we start to have less and less freedoms and rights. And I think America's free for a reason. People like being free. People like having freedom of speech, which is already being attacked, right? You see it in censorship. You see it in people are being indicted for something they said, right? Like, when did freedom of speech go away? Or when is it not applicable to everybody? We'll let this guy say what he wants, but this guy's being censored. It's just, and that goes back to biases in how the media is run, and it goes back to following the dollar, big donors and things like that. So yeah, those are some of the points I wanted to raise. It was just a topic that was on my mind recently, and I figured I would share my 2 cents. I think this is a great conversation to have, so I'd love to hear any comments, takeaways, thoughts, anything you'd like to elaborate on, anything you'd like to, cross-reference or fact-check me on that I may have misspoke. I try to be very vague if I'm not 100% sure, but yeah, hopefully you guys enjoy that.